Hello, I'm Charles Kovess, Australasia's passion provocateur. Welcome to this week's episode of the Charles Kovess Show, whether you're watching on Rumble or on YouTube or listening via one of the many podcast platforms. This is the place for you to be inspired to live a life of passion that is guided by your ever-increasing self-awareness of who you are and what you want your life to be. Passion is a source of unlimited energy from your soul that enables you to produce extraordinary results. Extraordinary. Ordinary people aren't passionate. Passionate people produce extraordinary results. One of my favorite quotes is this: greatness can only be achieved by harnessing passion. I want you to be great. So let's get into this week's big topic, which is the National Day of Australia, Australia Day, which is celebrated each year on the 26th of January. I love living in Australia. I love that I was born in Australia. I love that my parents, as refugees from Hungary in 1949, chose to come to Australia. This is a wonderful country that has been developed as in quite a unique way compared to many other countries. And I want to celebrate the truth of what this country is about by relying on former Prime Minister Tony Abbott's wonderful book called Australia, A History. I strongly recommend this book, particularly to Australians, but anyone who wants to understand Australia. And the subtitle is How an Ancient Land Became a Great Democracy. Of course, one of the factors that I love about Australia is that my parents were, after World War II, invited to come to Australia, as were many millions of refugees. The leaders of the country at that time understood what Australia needed. This book is a brilliant, clear history, not turgid, beautifully written about the 238 years since Australia, the first fleet landed in 1788 on the 26th of January in 1788. So we're now 238 years, and there are lots of people walking around saying that Australia's history is shocking and it was a slaughtering of Aborigines, and let me assure you that is total bullshit. This history articulates so clearly and well how fairly and appropriately this country became a great democracy, and how the Australian Aborigines who are living here were treated in an overwhelming number of instances brilliantly. I won't go into the constitutional elements of what 4% of Australians who are Aboriginal say, this is always Aboriginal land, always will be. That is a ridiculous proposition. And I'll give you just one element of that proposition, that in 1920, Hungary lost 2/3 of its territory. It was divided up at the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. They said this part's going to Ukraine, this part's going to Romania, this part's going to what was then Serbia. 2/3 of Hungary's territory was just ripped away from it. And still, 106 years later, that remains the case. This nonsense that if somebody lives on a piece of land that is theirs in perpetuity is indeed a nonsense. And the laws simply don't support that proposition. But I don't want to get into the nitty-gritties of that. For those of you who are not Australians, I urge you to find an excellent history, a well-regarded history of your own nation, to read about the history, the true history of your nation. Over the last 30, 40 years in Australia and in many Western countries, the woke movement has ceased to properly teach the histories of each respective nation. And young people are being taught lies about those histories. A book such as this by Tony Abbott solves those issues. Give this book, if you are in Australia, to your children and grandchildren. So I want to read some quotes that I think are profoundly important in why Australia has become the great democracy that it has. At page 16, so this comes right back to the start from 1788, but Tony Abbott goes way back to the first Magna Carta in 1215 AD, or some might say CE, Common Era, or Anno Domino, the year of the Lord. He says this: from about the time of Alfred the Great in 849 to 899 AD, right down to our own King Charles III, the current monarch of UK and the titular head of Australia in a constitutional monarchy, the monarchs have pledged in their coronation oath, first, to govern in accordance with the laws and customs of the people; second, to govern justly; and third, to uphold Christianity. Note, to uphold Christianity, because Christianity is the foundation of Western civilization. He goes on to write, at Runnymede in 1215, the rapacious and duplicitous King John was forced by his mutinous nobles to agree to the Magna Carta, the Grand Charter, or Great Charter of Freedoms, protecting rights, enshrining the courts, and limiting royal prerogatives. And there's this other sentence, telling sentence: however imperfectly executed, thoughtful Britons continued groping towards a concept of authority at the service of the people rather than as their master. An important principle in this game of freedom that you know is so important to me and to you, because in earlier shows I have said that freedom is what makes you a human being. Without freedom, if I put you into a cage, you are no different to an animal. Next quote from page 23. Tony Abbott highlights what a unique convict settlement Australia was. Let me quote: Sydney Cove was not a walled jail but an open settlement. The continual guarding of convicts was impossible, and convicts were awarded a degree of freedom unheard of anywhere else. They worked in their own clothes and without leg chains. They lived in huts. Many built their dwellings themselves and provided the labour that kept the colony alive. In what free time they had, they could trade or earn a wage and begin their second chance at life. They had legal rights and could own property. There was nothing like Sydney anywhere in the world. And another portion on the same page, Abbott writes, although drunkenness was indeed a problem in New South Wales and convicts could be lazy and dishonest, what critics overlooked was the human capacity for self-improvement. Aspiration, it turned out, drove even convicts to ameliorate their own condition and to build social order. On page 25, Tony Abbott refers to Governor Arthur Phillip, the first governor. He was a captain, but he was in charge of the colony. He was the head of the fleet that arrived in 1788. He says, while Governor Phillip was no modern-day bleeding heart liberal, it's abundantly clear that he did not want a colony of tyrannical jailers and suffering convicts. He wanted the laws of Britain transplanted to New South Wales. He wanted to proceed with kindness towards the Aboriginal people. He said he abhorred slavery. In Philip's writings, we can see the origins of a free society. At page 26, this decision to govern the colony under civil law was the key to the freer society that Australia was to become. Felons on British soil whose death sentence had been commuted typically forfeited their property and were subsequently disqualified from bringing civil actions in court. Yet the colony's civil court gave convicts, even those whose death sentence had been commuted, legal standing. Many important elements of English law were restricted, particularly in the early years of the colony, yet it remains remarkable how much of the rule of law, with fair trials and the presumption of innocence, would be applied in a settlement comprised almost entirely of convicted criminals. And I have said to you on many of my shows that the rule of law is a fundamental principle to a well-functioning society. And you can see right now in America, particularly in Minnesota, when people stop respecting the law, chaos ensues. On page 28, Tony Abbott talks about the benefits for Australia of England becoming the settlers of this nation and not France. He writes, "We have reason to be thankful that the British reached the continent first. France, an absolute monarchy, would shortly plunge into revolution and descend into terror." This is 1788. Remember, Bastille Day is celebrated for happening on the 14th of July, 1789. So this is 1 year after the First Fleet arrived. France, an absolute monarchy, would shortly plunge into revolution and descend into terror. Furthermore, British liberty, although far from perfect, was more substantial than anything on the European continent at that time. As well, the American experience had impressed on the British, of course, 1788 compared to 1776, and this year America is celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence of 1776. As well, the American experience had impressed on the British establishment the need for settler colonies to have a path to self-government, present freedom plus future self-government. And my last quote is, I want to jump ahead to the time where transportation of convicts was ending. And this was a big debate in Australia because a lot of wealthy people in Australia enjoyed having cheap convict labour. So originally transportation ended in 1840, so we're talking 52 years after the establishment of the colony. And then in 1849, Britain tried to start transportation again, 1849. When this convict ship arrived in June 1849, there was a huge public meeting protesting against this action. The most striking speaker, writes Tony Abbott, was Robert Lowe, an Oxford-educated lawyer who could deploy a poisonous tongue in his advocacy of popular causes. He described the pro-transportationists of the Legislative Council in New South Wales as, quote, traitors, trimmers, rosewater liberals and political ride waiters. Lowe worked within the moral universe of English liberty, calling on the crowd to, quote, exercise that right that every subject has to assert his freedom. Ominously, he added that, quote, as in America, oppression was the parent of independence, so will it be in this colony. This is a big deal, this whole freedom movement and the rule of law in Australia. And the last quote on page 97, while convict transportation was the founding purpose of British settlement, Its abolition, that's the abolition of convict transportation, helped define modern Australia. Increasingly, transportation came to be seen as the ultimate barrier to fuller measures of self-government. In other words, Australians wanted to govern themselves. They wanted the freedom to govern themselves, to have their own sovereignty. And indeed, I am fighting for that as well. I happen to be chairman of the board of the Alliance Council of Australia, and we are fighting to preserve Australia's sovereignty. So, those foundations of this country flow through today, and it forms the Australian character. Now, you all know that I love humour, and Australian humour is quite distinct. So there was no place like Australia and its history of the transportation and the wise leaders who understood that tyranny was not the way forward. And it was tough, it was tough to live. And I want to quote a couple of thoughts on one of my mates' books, How to Use Humour in Business and Life. Pete Crofts, who's a dyed-in-the-wool Aussie, and he talks about Aussie humour in chapter 8 of this book. Chapter 8, the branding of Australia. And he talks about the Australian sense of humour, the Australian idea of you've got to laugh, mate. No matter how tough times are, you've got to laugh. And he says, ha-ha skills give us a humorous way of thinking, one which I call paradoxical perception, that the best you could ever hope for in life is to be, quote, a successful failure. This comes alive in the story of the two Australian larrikins walking down the street. One suddenly bends over and picks up a pay packet, and his mate says, gee whiz, you're a lucky bugger. The guy had a look at the pay slip and replied, what do you mean lucky? Look at the bloody tax I pay. Very clever. Oh, very, very clever. Now, he then at page 266 quotes Rob Sitch, who was the producer of a wonderful movie called The Castle and the Dish. And Rob Sitch, wonderful, wonderful comedian, humorist, he says, quote, I think sometimes we make a mistake in drama. I mean, humour is such an important part of life. I think to take humour out of drama is to distort life. I think one of the Australian characteristics, if there is one, is that blokes particularly try to make a joke in the most difficult circumstances. Humour and drama go together in this country, possibly more than anywhere else. Humour and drama. And so I'm also chairman of the Australian Institute of Comedy, and our motto is, you got to laugh, mate. Lastly, I'll quote you Pete Crofts on his version of what it means to be Australian. He says this, you don't have to play sport to be an Australian. You don't have to own your own home to be an Australian. You don't have to sleep with a member of the opposite sex to be an Australian. You don't have to like a cold beer to be an Australian. You don't have to believe in God to be an Australian. You do have to have a sense of humour to be an Australian. So there it is. For those of you who don't know what it's like to be an Australian, here I am. I love sense of humour. I love our fight for freedom. I love our desire for sovereignty. And I urge people to understand the wonderful history of this country and not to be sucked in by lies about how the Aborigines who were here in 1788 were so disenfranchised and slaughtered and blah, blah, blah. That is a gross distortion of history. So I hope today's episode, if you're an Australian, inspires you to think more highly of this country. If you don't know much history, to learn history. And if you're not Australian, to take a deeper interest in the foundations of the country in which you live. That gives you a greater way and a more inspiring way to think about the decisions that you make in terms of where you want your country to go in the future. If you're new to the show, check the links in the show notes for our foundational principles and my background. And also there are the links to our websites, covest.com and charlescovest.com, where there are lots of resources and information about how I might help you and your teams to perform at a whole new level so that your teams and you achieve extraordinary results. Subscribe to the show if you haven't yet, and please share it with your friends and colleagues and family. It won't cost you anything except the risk of greater passion, greater awareness, and a greater enjoyment of your unique life. Again, thanks for watching or listening. And until our next show, may your week be full of passion, of humour, of ever-increasing self-awareness, so that you live your life more on your terms than on terms imposed on you by others. Have a great week. See you next week. Bye.